Hey friends, so I had another thought to share with you today, and it's something that I've been kind of working on for myself, and I think I maybe even had addressed it at one point in another video, but I think it's an interesting enough idea to just kind of give it its own video here. And essentially that idea is aperture control. And here's why I think aperture control is important. In my mind, the main purpose of being able to control the size of your aperture is I really think of the size of the aperture being the thing that controls the amount of air that flows out. And that air flow is essentially the thing that controls our volume. But then also that aperture control and being able to control the air is what controls the top end of our range. So let's kind of break those apart. So let's talk about volume first, because I think it's the most obvious. Obviously, so if we have an aperture that's like this, so maybe try to find some way. That actually kind of works. So if we have an aperture that's like this sized, a certain amount of air goes through like that, and you'll have a certain amount of volume that goes with it. And for this analogy, we'll call this a pretty good size aperture. And then as we were to ascend or roll in our lips or whatever we're doing, as that aperture gets smaller and creates more resistance, our sound will diminish in volume as well. Probably even quality too. But definitely the sound as it gets smaller. And so developing the strength to be able to hold that aperture open as you're releasing compressed air, which references a previous video I made, is an important component of playing in the upper register. Because what we all need to do is we're creating resistance with our musculature here and our tongue so that we get our lips to kind of vibrate more quickly. And as we're creating that resistance and we're kind of compressing through our corners or whatever method you're using, then it's natural for that aperture to start to shrink down. But then that gives you a sound. It gives you that sound as it just gets smaller as you go up. And that's kind of the problem with that. So the sound gets smaller, and then the other side of it that's important with aperture control, which is kind of related to that, is eventually it gets so small that as you heard, the sound just cuts off and it stops. Whereas if we can control how we open our aperture, keep that aperture open, then we can essentially increase our top end range, and our top end range will be a function of not like when does our aperture close and shut it off, but at what point do we just run out of strength here and compressional strength in our core to compress air, and maybe even a little bit of tongue strength. But essentially, at what point you're not being shut off you're not being shut off as quick from your aperture closing and just shutting everything down. Because once the aperture closes completely, there is no sound whatsoever. So you've got to have enough air coming through to vibrate our lips here a little bit. So and once you've closed that completely, so if you have a sound that as you go up in your register, that it eventually just stops, like it just quits. You're not just hearing or anything like that. It just quits. That means your aperture is closed. So what you need to develop is aperture strength, how to keep that aperture open, and that you can do through a couple of different ways. One, we've got to use less pressure, but less pressure is just part of the solution. Less pressure by itself doesn't fix it. You got to have like other correct mechanisms as well. So to develop that aperture strength, you have to have less pressure as you work on some exercise, just so that your lips can move and so you can control the aperture. That's one thing, because if you're using a lot of pressure, you can end up pinning that aperture closed or open either way. So less pressure is good. A lot of people will use lip bend exercises. So lip bend exercises, you'll hold a tone and then bend down to the note below it, using by just opening the aperture. And so what you want to do for those exercises is not bend by slowing the airstream or doing anything else. You want to bend it by opening the aperture. Let me grab a trumpet, I'll show you. Okay, so here's a standard lip bend exercise. So a lot of times when you play these exercises, it'll have you do it first with the valves, just mainly that's so you can hear the pitch. Once you get to the point that you know the pitch well enough, I don't know that using the valves is all that important. It's very difficult to do. Some people that do it really well, they can like bend it all the way down to that. So I have some more work to do with this. And to be clear, it's not dropping your jaw. It's just using that aperture, like it's using the muscles of expression here to like hold that aperture open or to pull that aperture open. Trying to get it down to that E flat, but I can't. But that's a good exercise to do. But the key is to do that exercise in other registers. So most times I've ever seen that exercise, it's often on that G. But you've got to like go. John Daniel's book does a lot of this as well. It's just really good. But you've got to essentially work up in the registers to start pulling that thing open. And it gets very difficult as you get in the upper registers because the notes are so close together. Sorry, just singing along. So it doesn't matter as much really if you fall down, especially in the upper register, because those notes now start getting to be a step and a half step apart. It doesn't matter if you drop down in pitch. The key thing is just to really feel that you are pulling that aperture open. Now, I'm just suggesting this as a thing for you to try. I'm not saying that this is what Maynard Ferguson does or whatever. I'm just telling you this is something I'm experimenting with and suggesting maybe you try it. And I think maybe I just noticed in my own playing that over the years, as I use more facial resistance or whatever, that I can notice that sound just gets quieter. And you can overcome it to a degree by just blowing harder, because as you blow harder, you'll open that aperture again. But at some point, it just ends up, you're fighting it. It ends, and I feel like that creates more resistance as well and more fatigue, and it just becomes more difficult. So I found for myself, if I'm more intentional about like as I'm kind of firming up here or rolling in or whatever the things you're doing, if I'm also kind of trying to open that a little bit, like that I can get notes to kind of zing out a little faster and easier with less like guttural force. And I'm thinking that's got to be a key to like being able to play higher, faster, and longer. So I can play high, and I can play loud, but I want to be able to play high and loud for a long time. Once you've done the lip bending exercise, then you could do simple things like scales or flow studies or whatever you like, where as you're ascending, you're just being intentional to pull those lips I shouldn't say pull the lips apart, hold the aperture in place and not let it close, even if you're firming up here. So I'm like intentionally like trying to keep that aperture open, because if I don't do that, what wants to happen is that aperture wants to get smaller and the sound will get smaller. And we probably have all heard people play that way. I hear that all the time. I'll hear. Sometimes I hear adults. I hear a lot of high school kids will say this, like, "Oh, I can play double G's. I can, play these notes." And then when you hear it, it's that like wee sound. I'm like, shit, that's whatever. Like, I don't know what you think you're doing with that, but no one's gonna ever hear it. So. There is a time and a place for maybe when you want that upper register to get thinner and smaller. That playing with that smaller aperture can be useful for when you're quiet playing, piccolo playing, things like that. But I don't think there's really much things where we want low, the mid register to be loud and the upper register to be really soft in a phrase. I mean, there's sometimes musical expression you might choose that, but usually as we're ascending in range, we're adding more. We're adding more. What's the word I'm looking for? We're adding contrast, but we're adding more tension. We're adding more of that, we're building the energy to it as we ascend in range. And if we descend in volume as we ascend in range, then it's sort of having on the one hand, you're increasing the intensity of something, but then also you're pulling it back, which could be a musical choice. But I think normally you'd want at least the increased tension of going up in range, and sometimes you might want to add to the energy by going up in range and getting louder. But if you go up in range and keep your volume the same, you're creating energy and tension, and if you go up in range and getting louder, you're creating even more energy to the music. And so I think just kind of being intentional with that's important. So anyway, let me wrap this up now. We're already at 12 minutes. Let me wrap this up and encourage you that if you already do this, let me know. I'd love to hear about it. If you think this is wrong, feel free to respectfully throw your comments in. But if you haven't given this much thought, I encourage you to try it and report back and let me know how you're doing. All right, friends, good luck. Bye.